Want to be a part of the conversation? Then let us know on the TNT Radio Interactive Live chat room at tntradio.live. Lighting the fuse for freedom. Today's News Talk, TNT Radio. You're listening to Connecting the Dots with Matt Ehret on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome for the third hour on Connecting the Dots, where I'm very, very happy to be joined by Dr. Aaron Good, who I recently encountered through a panel discussion that he had with Vanessa Beeley and a variety of other people, co-sponsored by the UK column on genocide and empire was the presentation he gave, but really it was understanding what is the nature of these inside jobs, deep events that have shaped so much or misshaped so much of our history. And Dr. Aaron Good is the author of an important book as well. It recently came out called The American Exception. He runs the American Exception podcast. And what I found very interesting, first of all, of the many things that I found interesting, was that you are attempting to do something that many would say is impossible, in the sense of trying to bring in an appreciation of the intentions, agendas, ideas that some might label conspiracy, which it is. It's people conspire to do things based on ideas, into an academically accepted sort of framework, which is difficult because most people in academia are taught a priori that if you try to introduce metaphysical agendas, like metaphysics is beyond physics, right? Intentions, ideas, you can't cut them in half. They're not ephemeral. But if you try to do that, you shouldn't be respected. But then it's like, how do you understand anything about why wars happen, why the Reichstag fires burned down, why did 9/11 happen, what's going on in the Middle East today, what's shaping our future? You can't know any of that stuff if you abide by socially accepted academic standards. So what you're doing is, I think, very interesting because you're somehow bridging it, and you're doing it pretty well. How are you? Maybe you could say a little something for the audience. What got you on this journey? What put you on this path that you find yourself on right now?
Well, I worked for, I grew up in a Democratic household, and I worked on political campaigns. I majored in political science. I worked on political campaigns in 2004, and then in 2008, I worked for Obama, and I expected him to go and try to fix some of the problems that were so obvious during 8 years of Bush. And I also thought that he's a Democrat, and he had as a person in one political party, if the previous political party had committed obvious and brazen high crimes, the logic is you should just go after him, because he could be like, you could just destroy the other party. You could be like, they're actually criminals. How could you ever not vote for our party if the other party is starting the Iraq war, killing hundreds of thousands of people, lying about why they have to do it? And yet Bush was like, Obama says, we have to look forward, not back. Torture, illegal war, all these things. And so that's such an absurd that I went to his inauguration. I mean, I went to the staff inaugural ball. I was an Obama staffer, and then seeing that he was a second George Bush made me think that, like, well, actually, it's just all these guys are basically Ronald Reagan over and over again. Something happened in the United States, and it made me look back at U.S. history, and especially the Kennedy assassination, because I was familiar with it after seeing Oliver Stone's movie as like an 8th grader or something like that in the theater. And I was aware of these sort of things, but then seeing how the president was kind of powerless to do what he should do by virtue of the logic of the position that as I understood it, it made me realize that there is an overriding force that controls U.S. politics, and that it doesn't really work the way that we're taught. And so I started to study U.S. history and some of these events, but also look at some scholars who had tried to look at this in an academic way. So not just writing about, not an Alex Jones sort of approach, but a really serious approach modeled on social science and historiography. And so I look at, like, Lance DeHaven Smith at Florida State was writing about state crimes against democracy. I befriended him, and I got into graduate school in political science. And Lance and a number of other academics, we went to to public administration conferences, academic conferences, for like 4 or 5 years. We collaborated together. We would have written things together, but Lance fell ill with Parkinson's, and he had to retire early. I mean, it came on really suddenly. It was very strange. And then he had to retire, and that never got to work. But I also started to collaborate with Peter Dale Scott. I worked on this book, American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. That's really my dissertation. And I attempted to break down the problems with political science and the problems with our regime as well. I mean, the system that we live under, and look at it in a sort of rational way, and to be as honest about what things we can say we know, and then what things we have to sort of surmise based on a preponderance of evidence. And we have to kind of contrive or put together a methodology that makes sense under the conditions that we live under, which is that since the end of World War II, we've had this clandestine state that has, as a matter of policy, we know that they do this. They seek to use covert operations, which means they want political outcomes to happen. They commit criminal acts. They plan and commit criminal acts, which is the definition of a conspiracy, routinely, just as a matter of policy. And these are institutionalized and bureaucratized, and we know them. And yet there is a taboo in political science and social science in terms of really gaming out what that means. Like, what does it mean when you have a system where the state can conspire and lie, and yet socially they create a situation where to accuse the government of conspiring and lying is anathema, right? Like, how does this duality exist? It doesn't make any sense. And when you think about it, it really does give these oligarchs the ability to veto democracy, which is exactly what they do in places like Iran in 1953. Oh, the people aren't voting the way that we want. They want to nationalize their oil. Well, we'll just use covert operations. They're not Nazis. They're not going to goose step into every place and say, we are the master race and we need to rule the world. They package it as liberty and freedom. And if they have to do something that's sort of Nazi-ish or imperialist or overtly imperialist or secretly fascist, they just use covert operations and they say, oh, it didn't happen. So that's
they may not be literally Nazis. Yeah, they're not literally Nazis with swastikas, but they're definitely drinking from the same well and using the same game plan on a lot of points, at least, that are relevant. That people should be considering.
I'm not saying they're not. Yes, I'm absolutely not saying they are Nazis, but because they aren't, but they do represent a kind of fascism in the core of it, which the fascism isn't really about the vibes. It's not about the hats that they wear. It's about the fact that it's an oligarchy in a modern state that will use the state to make sure that the oligarchy always wins. And they'll crush anything that stands in the way of that. That's the Nazis were empowered not because the entire German population was fanatical anti-Semites. It was because they feared the oligarchy feared a socialist revolution. And so Hitler was the guy that was crazy enough to actually kill everybody. So they empower this dude, and he really runs with it and takes it to its conclusion, which is, the end of over-aggressive empires. And that's what happened to him. But the U.S., as I say, they're not Nazis. They still employed a lot of them, and for the same reasons, to kill leftists.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because are you suggesting that actual high-level Nazis were not punished at Nuremberg and were given new jobs under the U.S. military-industrial complex? Are you suggesting such a thing?
Of course, yes, and Italians and Japanese. I mean, the Japanese case is even in some ways crazier than the German one, because Japan, since the end of World War II, has been ruled by the LDP. The LDP is a conservative party, but it was established with a hush fund of over $100 million worth of diamonds and platinum looted from China, that had been secured by this guy Yoshio Kodama, who was a Yakuza person initially, like a gangster, an opium lord and everything else, who was given like a rear admiral position in the Navy so he could go and loot, China. And then after the war, he had all these diamonds and gold, and they sprang him from prison. He should have been hanged as a war criminal. And that money was used to set up a slush fund for the LDP, the political party. And it's basically been a one-party state. So Japan is basically ruled by a party that was established with a fascist slush fund, and by a person who was a CIA asset. Japan is functionally like their government is basically a CIA asset when you come down to it. And in Germany, of course, they rescue a lot of these people, like Reinhard Gehlen is maybe the most notorious one. And he becomes the chief of West German intelligence somehow, even though he was Hitler's intelligence chief. And they rewrite history to say that, the Nazis didn't actually set the Reichstag fire. And the reason that they rewrote that history is because a lot of the people that they'd put in high places in the government were involved in that in that. And Peter Dale Scott's written about that. He has a whole like dossier. I don't know if he's ever published it, but he's written about that. In Italy, there was like a whole secret network, Gladio, or the Propaganda Due Lodge, which is part of something that we use Gladio as kind of a shorthand. But there's all these networks of
It's the sword,
terror
right?
networks and for the Roman Empire's sword, the Gladio, or Gladius, or whatever it was. It's named after that, the gladiator sword. And this is something that over Europe, they've had this kind of secret apparatus that is really there to make sure that if they need to intervene, especially if the Americans don't like what's going on. There's a number of assassinations. In America, we've got the 60s assassinations, JFK, MLK, RFK, Malcolm X. But in Europe, there's a lot of these Gladio type things that seem to be that same hidden hand of just U.S. imperialism. The Aldo Moro assassination, the Alfred Herrhausen assassination, the Swedish Olof Palme assassination, different bombings like the Piazza Fontana bombing. I mean, there's this whole
Weren't
history
we
of
told
the kind of dark force
weren't we told that it
ruling these
was
things.
I thought we were told it was Marxist-Leninist terrorist cells that carried out these murders of Herrhausen and Aldo Moro and the Red Brigades. But are you saying that these weren't Marxist-Leninist terrorists that we were told we should be afraid of during the Cold War when the Kremlin and Beijing were our arch nemesis? You're saying that there was actually something else behind them that wasn't the Kremlin or Beijing?
Right. It wasn't really organic communists who staged those bombings like the Piazza Fontana bombing or the Herrhausen bombing. And it wasn't a bunch of communists or one communist who shot President Kennedy. It wasn't communists who burned down the Reichstag. It was fascists in all those cases, making it happen.
The irony.
Yes.
You know, I think it's important for people to just let this seep in, because I mean there's been certain, I think, trauma due to the 60 years of propaganda that many people, especially baby boomers, were subjected through. Drop and cover, hide under your desk for the nuclear apocalypse, be afraid of your neighbor who might be a commie agent. And it was, people underestimate the influence of the FBI dictatorship over the America and the psyche that was affected in your average American living through that was never resolved. And today a lot of the same game plan is being like revived yet again, almost like a spell is being cast to revive a lot of the prejudices that were put into us artificially because we didn't resolve World War II. And we allowed the leading Nazis and fascists, as you just pointed out, to take over, or at least become part of a new apparatus to terrorize us. Does this tie in? And we only have 3 minutes before the next commercial break, so we might just only tease an answer out of you there. But does this tie into the rise of Islamic terrorism since the 70s and 80s and in the present day? Or are these two different operations, this Gladio terrorist thing in the 60s and 70s and 80s versus Islamic terrorism that we're living through today?
Well, the Western hand in Islamist terror goes back, actually it predates the original Gladio, because it's I think it's in the late 20s that they established the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's the Suez Canal Company that gives a land grant to the what becomes the Muslim Brotherhood. Saeed Al-Banna, I think, is the guy's name, and it was the Suez Canal Company. So it's the British Empire, and they wanted to create this entity that could act as a counterweight or a foil, or potentially even assassinate people who were nationalists or socialists. So people like that would become Nasser. Nasser wasn't the person, but he eventually becomes the embodiment of this. Like that's what the Muslim Brotherhood was there to stop Egyptian nationalism and socialism. And so it goes beyond that. Now in the 70s, it really ramps up, beginning with by the 1979, you have the Iranian Revolution, which is strange. And I think that the West may have manipulated things, especially ex-CIA people, Safari Club people may have tried to tip the scales so that it was Islamists that took over and not Marxists or socialists or nationalists. But that's a contested point. But they also fueled the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I mean, this has been their MO, and then throughout the 80s, they're using this Al-Qaeda network basically to supply the Mujahideen. And then in the 90s, after the Cold War, they used these same people all over Central Asia, the Balkans. They used the Al-Qaeda to try to assassinate Gaddafi in like 1996. I mean, they've ISIS is very, very, very suspicious. I mean, kind of over the top, obvious sock puppet of this whole enterprise. I mean, this is one of their main tools to extend their U.S. hegemony into regions formerly dominated by the Soviet Union.
I got a question for you that I was thinking about. I didn't really look into it too deeply, but a number of high-level Nazis I know were sent into Syria and Egypt after World War II, and I was curious because in trying to figure out if the 7-Day War was manufactured, if so, how. 6-Day War. Yeah. 6-Day War is manufactured.
Yeah.
Right. I couldn't help but notice that the Mossad had been getting information that they were paying for from Nazis. I don't know if Klaus Barbie was among them, but they were paying for intelligence from Egypt, from Syria, provided to them by a lot of these SS officers, which is an irony unto itself, maybe less so of an irony when you look at today's world. But I was curious if you knew that if this played a role into the intelligence that was given to the Israelis that they used and acted upon to preemptively strike out at the Arab world in the 7-Day War or 6-Day War, or is there? Yeah, did that come across your screen?
I mean, what we know is that it was a preemptive war, and that Israel started it, and that they, the different versions of it. Oh, we accidentally acquired this empire or not. But now, if you look back at it and you think of how maniacally they are, I mean, you just had Benjamin Netanyahu saying, "Oh, from the river to the sea." I would guess that maximalist Zionists, people who wanted greater Israel, and that they did this intentionally. I would guess. I mean, they started the war. I don't think that Nasser wanted a hot war like that. And they've been occupying the place ever since, which suggests also that they weren't like, oh, oops, if it was really an accident, they would have, or they didn't want it, they would be getting out of it. And they're not. They're actually trying to take the rest of that land now by just slaughtering the population, it seems. So I don't know so much about I haven't looked too much into the details of like what it was that led to this and what was the sort of excuse that they offered for why it was a preemptive attack. But just the basic knowledge of the fact that it was a preemptive attack, and that the U.S. likely had to have greenlit it in some capacity, because the way that they ignore the fact that the U.S. liberty was attacked suggests some very strange coordination or a lot of generosity towards the Israelis to allow them to do something like that. I mean, they just attacked a U.S. ship repeatedly to try to kill everybody on board for whatever reason. There's different people speculate as to why that was, but it was
a single strip, right? So they were undoubtedly picking up all kinds of intelligence information that they shouldn't have access to, so they had to die. That being said, that's disturbing, and that leads into some of the, I think, discussion that we're going to be having after a commercial break, dealing with the present age and maybe jumping back in the past again. All right, so we'll join people back in about a minute on TNTRadio.live.
TNT's Steve Malzberg.
If a president could be prosecuted for things he did, which he believed and was advised by his lawyers, what was the duty of the president to do, and then after the fact, after he's president, he could be prosecuted. The example has come up today many times. Well, when Joe Biden leaves office, he could be prosecuted for not securing the border. Barack Obama okayed drone strikes against American citizens overseas. He could be prosecuted for murder. I mean, this opens up a whole can of worms. Pandora's box, I think, is the term that Trump used.
Steve Malzberg on today's News Talk, TNT.
People might tell you that Lyme doesn't kill people, but we are losing people. People disappear from their lives.
One of the scariest things that I had to deal with was memory loss. Not just like I don't remember what I did last week, but like I forgot all the words to my own songs. I remember going to my primary care physician and he was like, "You are 100% healthy, there's nothing wrong with you." And my response was, "That's impossible, I'm dying."
I wasn't working, so I had all of these hospital bills. We had to move out of our home and move into my parents' basement.
I just wish I could have truly been present in those big moments, you know, when she took her first steps or, you know, her first day of preschool. Lyme is such a thief, and it goes undetected because no one is looking for it.
For more information and prevention tips, go to projectlyme.org.
Are we on the air?
Am I on the air?
You're on the air?
On the air 24/7. Your news talk giant, TNT.
All right, we're back for the second segment of the third hour with Dr. Erin Good. We're talking about inside jobs, how to understand them, and how to properly wrap the mind around the fact of conspiracies, that human beings are a creature that conspires to make things happen, for good or for bad. We get together, we have an idea, we put it into action, and sometimes if you have a lot of political influence and power, that could cause a lot of destruction. Or inversely, the good. You could do good things if you have political power, or bad. But conspiracies are important, and for anybody who is encountered voices that say, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist," take it as a compliment in a sense. Because you're a realist. You recognize reality is what it is, but it's still challenging because you can't see them. You'll never hear or see an intention. An intention is something we have to sort of infer from the facts, but we have to be rigorous about our facts, because somebody could say, "Oh, I'm lying to you," or they could tell you a lie. Not they can't say I'm lying to you, but they could tell you a lie. And it's like the oligarchy thrives in this like domain, right, of plausible deniability, where people just, you could always rely on the fact that maybe I'm telling the truth, you know, even though all of the evidence has showcased that everything you've touched has turned to fire. You could still say, "Oh, but I'm not really an arsonist." But it's like everything you've touched has turned to fire. but I'm not an arsonist. I mean well. And so there's this realm of deniability that the oligarchy thrives in. So what do you think has caused people's minds to fall for this, despite the fact that human reason would easily detect that they're being lied to, that the JFK murder, that all of these inside jobs have justified surveillance states, wars that have only benefited a small few and not benefited most people? What was there a shift, do you think, culturally that induced people to become more susceptible to this? Or has this always been a problem with humanity?
I think it's a problem inherent in civilization that it's always been a top-down thing, and some of the fundamental social realities are dictated from on high. In an oligarchic fashion. You go back to Plato writing in ancient Greece, and he uses Socrates to like make up these as a sock puppet to kind of make arguments in that book, like a fictional Socrates. And he at one point describes the myth of the metals, because there's one guy who says, like, justice is a joke. It's really just whatever is in the interest of the powerful, right? Which is in the way saying, like, the powerful are always going to conspire to like rig the game and then determine what is and isn't allowed, and that's justice, and then people are going to get screwed, right? And the Socrates character says, well, you kind of need some kind of order in the world. And if you had a city, think about, you'd have to make up a way to get people to like accept that like some people are going to be soldiers and other people get to be like rulers. You could just say that some people have metal, and that you say everybody has metal in their souls. Some people have gold and they get to be the kings. Other people have iron and they get to be the farmers. And that's how it works. And of course, he wasn't saying that the metals are like a true thing. He was using it as a hypothetical myth, like a set of lies to tell people, to get them to accept the fact that some people get to be in charge and get to have all the good stuff, and other people have to do the harder work and have less materially. I mean, he's talking about lies for social cohesion, right? And so the oligarchy that's going to rule is going to have to come up with some stories to tell people in order to keep things going the way that they should. In a sense, a lot of these covert operations are like extensions of that. They're just going to, they have to get the outcome that they want because they're the bosses. And their job is to be the boss. Their job is to plan how things are going to be run, and they benefit from it, so they keep it going, and they make up stories to tell people. Like, that's how slavery gets established in the United States. You kind of invent this idea of whiteness that didn't really exist the same way in the early days. They used a lot of indentured servants, and the black and white servants were sort of in the same boat. But once that becomes kind of untenable for a number of reasons, they start using a lot of African slaves, and they invent this idea of slavery, which is like a vicious lie that becomes widely accepted because civilization creates power structures and sense-making institutions that tell people how it is. And so even and we believe we are like always saying, oh, we're liberty and democracy, we're always doing good things, but we also know that if we're paying attention that we're an empire and we've done a lot of shady things. And if you know the history of the CIA, you are aware that they conspire and commit crimes and then have cover stories about it so they can lie about it. The problem that we're running into is that because I think this empire has run its course and is really on a downward spiral, the things that they're having to do to intervene, even with the so-called hidden hand, are like not very hidden anymore. Like Joe Biden is saying on TV, "Oh, if Russia invades Ukraine, the Nord Stream is not going to happen." And somebody asks, "Are you saying they're going to blow it up, or what are you saying?" He's like, "I'm saying it won't happen." I mean, he's like overt about it, right? That's not an exact quote, but that's the gist of it. And then they do blow it up, and they just say, "Oh, we didn't do it." And it's not even plausible deniability. It's just flat power lie. It's just a straight up like what obviously happened did not happen. And we are you going to say we're all liars and all the TV networks are liars and all the congressmen and cabinet officials and everybody? Like, you can't say that. So we're all just like, we can't even say grass is green. We can't even have a discussion about it. Democracy can't function really like this. That's why we're in this strange, terrible mess now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like in the past, one could say that there was a little bit more care given to the lie, to manage the lie after the Gulf of Tonkin or what have you. I mean, there's so many examples of human beings being screwed around with and lied to, but there was an effort to maintain it. Whereas now there's this hubris, this sloppy like hubris. And do you think that this sloppiness or this disregard for even trying to cover up the lie and just saying what I'm going to do, and then doing it is a sign of strength or weakness?
It is clearly a sign of weakness, and the rest of the world, I don't think, falls for it. But in the West, because civilizations create their own, they dominate all the institutions that exist to really allow people to make sense of things on a large scale. So even if everybody that we would talk to, because we talk to politically aware people or engage with them, they would know that there was a coup in Ukraine in 2014, that the U.S. obviously blew up the Nord Stream or some force affiliated with the U.S. obviously committed those crimes. The rest of the world knows it, but we are not allowed to know it, at least not in a way that it becomes brought into the discussion. I mean, even with the situation in Gaza, there's this issue of like, how many people did Gaza massacre? Like, of those people that were massacred on October 7th, how many were massacred by Hamas and how many were killed by Israeli forces? Logically, if you think about what Hamas would have been trying to accomplish, they wouldn't have benefited from massacring anyone. But the Israelis, because they have used this to justify this genocidal campaign, they really did benefit from this. And when you look at those cars that were blown up out there and like really incinerated, you're like, there was no way that was done by one of those Hamas bottle rockets that they're always firing. Like, that had to be. And then you find out there's Apache helicopters. It's not even discussed in the West. It didn't happen. And I think part of the reason we're in this situation now where so many of the lies are just absurd, and yet there's nothing to do about them, like the whole Russiagate hoax, for example. I mean, I didn't believe that from the very beginning, and then everything else just confirmed it. It was too convenient and too perfect, and it didn't make any sense from like the Russian side anyway. It was absurd. But you couldn't, even still today, people argue about it. There's no way, even the other side, the Republicans can't do anything about it. Trump has the Justice Department and he can't get to the bottom of it. He has supposed control of the CIA and he can't get to the bottom of it in a way that it's like a clear-cut victory for him, which it should have been, even though I'm no supporter of Trump in any way, shape, or form. So we're now at the point where, because what we want is so crazy, it's so insane. After the end of the Cold War, I mean, deciding to try to rule the world during World War II and then really going for it, and that's what happens during the Cold War. And then they win in the Cold War, but then the project of global dominance is still alive, and they want it to go on forever, and they state this explicitly. The problem is that you let Russia and China into the global economy, and they eventually start to gain wherewithal to counterbalance against the power of the U.S. And since the U.S. is like, well, this can't happen, we have to be able to rule the world forever, they have to do crazier and crazier things to try to control the strategically important areas, especially in the Middle East. And I think the influence of Israel has guided them even more in that direction, because they have an enormous amount of power in the U.S. And so we've fought these fights that are stupid in terms of like imperial logic. Like Iraq was a disaster, Syria was a disaster, the Ukraine is a disaster. But because their idea is, well, like, well, if we don't not control these areas, we're not going to be able to rule the world forever, then we just have to. And if it means doing dumber and more obviously criminal and gangsterish things, they just keep doing it. And it's coming to a head now. It's like, are they really going to go further with they can't, Ukraine is lost. In what are you going to do with the people in Yemen? What you have these kind of vulnerable outposts in Iraq and Syria that you're basically illegally occupying if you're the US. Are they going to go to war to defend those? Are you going to have Americans die to try to fight other countries because those countries are trying to stop a genocide? I mean, it's becoming more and more absurd because their objectives are insane, but they won't abandon them. And so it's just what we see now are these bad decisions, but the bad decisions are sort of downstream from the source of the problem, which is that the US is run by maniacs who think that they must rule the world and they cannot accept the fact that this is untenable. And now we're in this weird time period where what the US wants is clearly impossible, and it's destructive and it's damaging. And if they don't stop, it's going to do more damage to this country and to the West in general. But they seem incapable of course correcting. They're just going to say like, oh, none of these things happened if it's inconvenient, and we're not going to deal with anything because dealing with it would be too painful to the prime directive, which is global dominance über alles. It's a very strange time to be alive because the Chinese and Russians and other countries that are America's adversaries they're basically in the position of they just need to tell the truth as far as public diplomacy goes, just say what America's actually doing. And America's job is to basically make sure that everybody is lied to constantly and hope that the lies drown out people who might be interested in telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how that is also visibly shifting in a short period of time, where I know that we saw with the case of the bioweapons facilities in Ukraine, there was all this evidence that the Russians and the Chinese tried to bring to the UN Security Council, and nobody would hear it. It wouldn't be heard. Everyone would just like put their fingers in their ears, walked up, left the room. So they couldn't actually present the evidence of what is visibly a clearly provable Pentagon-run bioweapons facility complex in Ukraine, tied to the Biden graft clan as well. But, increasingly, as the illusion of this forever hegemon is breaking down, it seems like just knocking at the cracks is creating more and more fissures. Like now you have South Africa, a member of the BRICS, presenting very, very clear war crimes to the public world. And it's not so easy to just scrub this very easy to read 84-page report. Well, very painful to read, but very, very well put together 84-page report, which is going viral. And whole nations are now finding the courage to stand up and endorse what South Africa is doing, which is interesting. I don't know if that would have worked if this same thing were done 2 years ago or a year ago, but you're seeing, I think, a certain, as you just pointed out, or just the truth repeating itself is causing what seemed to be this giant Goliath to just like melt down increasingly. So are you generally an optimist on these things, or like do you think that the US is going to like go for broke and even risk nuclear war?
There's the risk of that, but it just seems that it would be so stupid to do that. But they've done many stupid things. But I'll say this, the fact that it's clear they're going to lose in Ukraine, and it's clear what they're doing now. Everything that they say about it it's so absurd to hear them talk at Davos or anywhere else. Everything, any press briefing about Blinken or that Kirby guy, the US has never looked so absurd on the world stage. And the rest of the world, I mean, the US had like a tiny percentage on its side in these UN votes. And it's strange because it's at the same time that we've had a kind of shift towards like wokeness, which I'm a person on the political left, and on these on identity politics issues, I'm pretty much on the left side of things. But a lot of the way that they have like packaged this, like about how you should listen and center people of color and so on, and that's kind of the zeitgeist even in the corporate world and the mainstream. But it's like now we're seeing how phony this is, because they're basically like, no, all the 99% of the world, these are like these people people of color barbarians. Like they're wrong. They must be anti-Semites. I mean, the idea of slandering South Africa, which was the original apartheid state, and whose leader, Nelson Mandela, has been like venerated as a saint. And you go back and listen to him, and he was always talking about the Palestinians too, saying that they need to be liberated. Yeah. So it's not some new thing, but they're just saying, oh no, they must be anti-Semites and they must be bigots. The country that was an apartheid state is a bunch of bigots or something like that, is essentially what we're being told. Nobody believes it except for a handful of people in the West. But even in the US, it's 70% want a ceasefire in Gaza, despite all the propaganda. I mean, that's amazing. Even in the US and in the rest of the world, it's much higher because they're going to get more of the story. So it's never been as ridiculous in terms of what they're putting out there and trying to defend. And so finally, these countries can actually stand up, like South Africa, who I'm sure had the blessing of Russia and China in this endeavor. Not that, but I think that they really wanted to do it. I mean, you hear the people that are speaking there, and they're very compelling. The South African side was, and the Israeli side, it was, embarrassing. It was horrific. It was like you're trying to defend the indefensible. So
I know. No, I've never heard somebody try to say like, yeah, no, I've never heard so many logical backflips and contortions to try to like always say and re-say, oh, but it's the context here. It's the context. They're very clearly, the South Africans clearly pointed out very, very hardcore facts, very, very clear, calling for explicit genocide and then doing it. And to say, oh, but it's the context is the weakest possible line of argumentation. When we get back from a short commercial break, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about October 7th as a possible inside job. So
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
Remember when you were in math class and they told you to check your work? You do remember that, right? Let's say you have 5 minus 3, and that equals 2. You want to check your work, go, well, take the answer 2, add 3, it equals 5. Correct, right? Well, you can work backwards when checking your work when it comes to why the planet is warming. At least I can, with my hypothesis that this is geothermal. In other words, the input of extra energy from what is going on in the bottom of the ocean. How can I do that? Well, let's take a look at what's going on. There's less cloudiness in the tropics now. We all know that clouds are formed by the air going up, right? So that means there must not be as much air going up. Why would that be? Well, if we went from the North Pole to the South Pole, we had an average vertical velocity, and because of the normal distribution of temperature, the greatest vertical velocity, so where it's warm and moist, which would be the tropical oceans, then we'd have a certain distribution, right? Well, what happens when that distribution is disturbed by distortion? In other words, it's warming more in the north and it's warming more in the south than it is in between. Well, guess what? Less vertical velocity, less clouds. Less clouds, more sun hitting the ocean. More sun hitting the ocean, more outgoing long-wave radiation. So this is being observed now. The mistake being made by people on my part of the argument, in my opinion, is that they believe that is the tail wagging the dog. It's not. The dog that wags the tail is the input of geothermal energy. That warms the oceans, that puts the water vapor into the atmosphere, leads to the distortion, leads to the difference in the vertical velocity patterns. So you see, right in front of you, I checked my work on his hypothesis. This is TNT climate and weather watchdog meteorologist Joe Bastardi asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you got.
JDRF's vision is to create a world without type 1 diabetes. The type 1 diabetes community is at the heart of everything JDRF does. We were founded by the type 1 diabetes community. In the main, we are governed by the type 1 diabetes community, we're energised by the type 1 community, and we're accountable to the type 1 diabetes community. It's on their behalf that we exist, and it's on their behalf that we must succeed. JDRF exists to rid the world of type 1 diabetes. It's easy to say, but it's hard to do. So for us, that means rallying all the resources and all the people and all the organisations required to make that a reality as quickly as possible. The world's best researchers, exciting innovative companies, and the passion of the type 1 diabetes community, then delivered through the health system so lives get better every day, day after day, until the day we find a cure. To everybody in the type 1 diabetes community, no matter your age or stage with the disease, whether you were diagnosed recently or a long time ago, we need you to know that we are here working on your behalf to deliver a world without type 1 diabetes as quickly as we can. Thank you to everybody who supported JDRF in so many ways. You are making our vision of a world without type 1 diabetes possible.
Deconstructing psyops, propaganda, and mainstream media garbage. Connecting the dots. You're with Matt Ehret and Connecting the Dots on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, we're back for the third segment of the third hour with Dr. Aaron Good. I'd like to ask you, Dr. Good, Dr. Good. Aaron is okay?
Yeah, of course.
All right, let's do Aaron. October 7th, in your assessment, was it or was it not an inside job?
Well, I wouldn't put that fine a point on it because these things are kind of complicated and sophisticated in the way that they are done. There's a number of reasons to suggest that it was a deep event of sorts, meaning that it's well, the way that Peter Dale Scott describes it, mysterious events that involve violence or law breaking are embedded in extant covert activities, serve to enlarge state secrecy, and are subsequently obscured systematically by the state and the media. So that could sort of apply to a lot of these things that are kind of shady and have intelligence angles to them. I mean, Hamas is an entity that exists, and they do have serious antipathy towards Israel. And in a sense, I think that even though Israel took this and used it as a pretext for a campaign that they really wanted, in some ways, Hamas may ultimately be achieving some goals here, because I think that this is going to end up weakening Israel and really delegitimizing it in the eyes of the world. I mean, you have people like Lawrence Wilkerson saying that, like, this could mean the end of Israel. And I don't think that's impossible. Now, what was the angle of it that makes it a deep event potentially? Well, there are a number of things that are suspicious about it. For one thing, there are the ignored warnings. I mean, the most obvious thing that we see here that should make us suspicious, first of all, is the response. The fact that this was used to embark on something that is of much greater scale and is pretty insane and indefensible, but also something that couldn't have been done. And we know that they wanted to do it for a long time. We know that Netanyahu has no interest in a two-state solution. John Kennedy Jr. in the George magazine wrote an article about how Bibi's people basically incited and brought about the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin back in the 90s, who was the last serious voice for a two-state solution on the Israeli side. So we know that these people are totally opposed to a two-state solution. We know that they actually created Hamas specifically because they didn't want a two-state solution. And they've said, Netanyahu has said repeatedly himself, keep supporting Hamas because that's the way to make sure there's no two-state solution. And now he's recently said Israel needs to rule from the river to the sea, which is also more evidence for the genocide court. It's insane. So that alone should make us very suspicious. Now, Hamas is made up of people whose parents were killed by Israel, who've lived a lot of them have lived, and most of them have lived in this Gaza concentration camp for their whole lives, because a lot of them are very young. It's a horrific situation. They do genuinely want to defeat Israel. On that night, it looks to me that the whole purpose was to overwhelm the Israeli security forces in the immediate vicinity of where they had broken out of the Gaza concentration camp, and to take hostages back. That's what I think their goal was, and that makes sense tactically if you think about it. Now, Israel has this other policy, the Hannibal Directive, where they don't want IDF soldiers taken as hostage. They'd rather just blow them up as they're retreating or running away, because they don't like the Palestinians to have the leverage of hostages. It looks a lot like that was applied, and there's more confirmation of this from people admitting that there was massive friendly fire on that night. It looks like they made the decision to deploy the Hannibal Directive and to kill a lot of Israeli hostages, and they killed some Hamas people too, rather than allow them to be taken back into Gaza and held hostage, and that they used their own friendly fire massacre essentially as propaganda to say that they had committed all of these atrocities. I am not convinced. I mean, Kit Klarenberg said, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I don't think that Hamas massacred anyone. I can't say that that's true, because there's a lot of chaos out there. And even if Hamas likely did kill some of the people, even in the crossfire, but I do think that they tactically, and based on the evidence that we've seen and based on the way that this has been abused, I think that there's every reason to surmise that it's most likely Hamas wanted to just take hostages and didn't want to massacre people, because massacring people would damage them. They need global opinion on their side to some degree. Going out and massacring people would just be totally counterproductive. But the Israelis need to have had them massacre people, because otherwise, how do you justify what they're doing now? So those things to me, and the fact that there's been so little investigation about it, suggests that this was exploited. There's also the question of insider trading that has been discovered, indicated by some investigations. Clarenberg also wrote an article on this. So some people seem to have foreknowledge. There's a whole lot of ignored warnings about this. There was the moving of
the Egyptians,
music festival.
The Egyptians launched a warning like 10 days beforehand, right? That was clear, and they did nothing. Yeah.
Yes, and some Egyptian and intelligence analysts also said, I think it was a group of mostly women that said, like, hey, there's a lot of suspicious activity around here, and these things look like they're sort of training for something, and they put the kibosh on it. And, like, think about why they would do that. Well, they've benefited from this to a degree. If they really want to try to go for this greater Israel project, maybe it's Netanyahu's own political fortunes have something to do with why he responded this way, thinking a bigger war could save him. But the main thing is they just have wanted to do this for a long time. Another thing that's quite suspicious is, or indicates some very sinister machinations here, a leaked report from an Israeli think tank that was used by, employed by, or contracted by the Israeli intelligence agency, as I understand it anyway. They put out a report saying, what should we do with the Palestinians? And they had three options, and one of them was just put them into the Sinai Desert. And they actually argue in this paper, like, yeah, this is actually the good policy that produces the good results. It's really the only one they even entertain. They're basically arguing we need to expel the Palestinians. And you immediately saw talk of this from different people. In fact, Robert RFK Jr.'s campaign manager, Amaryllis Fox, was posting on Twitter days before that report was leaked, was posting like, hey, maybe we could put them in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula, just for a little bit, and then they could come back. She can't possibly be that naive to think that they would ever let them back. I mean, that is actually, and then a couple of days later, that report is leaked. So, you got to wonder, does she still have some connections in the intelligence world that were, encouraging that? I mean, it's all very, very strange. But there's just a lot of evidence to suggest that they exploited it. They may have known it was coming. It's not a false flag. It wasn't like it was Israelis dressed up as Hamas doing this. And it couldn't be totally a straightforward inside job, but there are elements that suggest that this was allowed to happen or manipulated in a certain way, so it would unfold a certain way. And how much foreknowledge they have, or whether it was opportunistic, or whether they bungled it with the friendly fire on accident and then just decided to use that as a pretext for something they wanted to do anyway. These are the kinds of questions that we can't really answer. And so anytime you're working in these realms, you've got to think in sort of probabilistic terms, knowing that it's a black box of a state here, the Israeli state, and the U.S. state's intertwined with this too. And they don't have to let us know many things unless they want us to. And that's the position that we're in. But there's a lot of reason to be very suspicious of this.
There's a lot of, I could see very honest people within Hamas. But what you're also saying, doesn't that kind of imply that at least maybe there's something shady that I've always found shady, at least with these billionaires who manage a big chunk of Hamas from Qatar? There's like a handful of these billionaires, not millionaires, billionaires in Qatar, not in Palestine, but who have a huge amount of influence. Do you think that there's any evidence of collusion between some of these creatures? The Muslim Brotherhood, or the IDF, or people in Palestine more generally?
Well, this is, as far as I know, there's zero evidence, and yet what you're describing is a opportunity for chicanery. I mean, this idea of who are these billionaires? Or who are the people that are total funding any parts of Hamas? How many connections are there between external actors and Hamas? How many people that would seem on the surface to be genuine, sincere supporters of Hamas could be getting instructions from other people, encouraging them to do X, Y, and Z? I don't think that there's any evidence of something like that happening. And yet, when you stop to think about it, you start to understand why terrorism and these kinds of acts are so useful, because You could have a terrorist group committing acts of terror, and they're totally sincere. Everyone who's carrying it out could be a true believer in the cause potentially, and yet somewhere up the road they could be funded or manipulated by other actors who have a totally different agenda. I mean, I think that that's what goes on. Like for ISIS, for example, they seem to be a tool of the U.S. and Israeli neocons, the people that are sort of maximalists, wanting to dominate the Middle East, in whatever way is necessary. But the people on the ground could be genuinely committed to whatever to the whole fanatical ideology that they espouse. But who is paying them? Who gives their marching orders? Ultimately, these are questions that are raised, and that we have to accept the fact that we can't answer it. But if we speculate about it, it leads to the conclusion that we drastically need to change the way the world is governed. We need to stop all the covert operations, all the chicanery. Find a way to solve problems. World peace is totally achievable. And that's where I am an optimist, because all of these problems are quite easy to solve. Ukraine was very easy to solve. They never should have had that coup in 2014, and they never should have stopped those negotiations from going forward, which would have ended the war very shortly, which I think that's the only reason that Russia invaded, was to bring them to the negotiating table. And we're totally in denial about that. They have this weird story of like, oh, the Ukrainians rose up and defeated them, and so that he didn't take over all of Ukraine. The Russians never wanted all of Ukraine. I don't think they want all of Ukraine now. Why would they? Why would you want to rule a bunch of or a population that hates you and is kind of Nazi-ish and is also a kind of a basket case anyway economically? Why would you want that? You just don't want NATO to be able to park nukes there, but they can't even admit that. So this is we are in a time period where it's clear that this old way of doing things has failed, and its worst characteristics are only more and more obvious at this point. And yet, because they can't accept that they need to make a transition to sort of acting as a lawful member of the global community, we are here in a time of great conflict when we should be on the verge of world peace. If the West wanted it, if the oligarchy that runs the U.S. empire would decide that that's what they needed to go for, that's what we would have. We would have world peace.
If the U.S. was serious about peace in the Gaza, Blinken came out with his proposition backed up by the Saudis for an off ramp, some idea of a new post-Hamas governorship of Palestine, and they even gave it a name. And they had all of these complex ideas about how this was going to work out, and then it took 2 seconds for Bibi Netanyahu to just say, "No, that's never going to happen. We're going for broke," and then Iran. But if the U.S. actually was serious about a peace process, what would a sane approach be to actually get there? With Israel being governed by the current fanaticism that it is, how would you do it?
You just have the U.S. use the National Security or the UN Security Council to impose a two-state solution. It'd be very easy if the U.S. wanted to do it. Jeffrey Sachs lays this out. I personally think a one-state solution is better, and I have zero sympathy for Zionism, and I think it's completely insane. And I think the fact that you don't even really question the basic premise of it just reflects an enormous amount of propaganda. And it's not because I'm against the idea of a Jewish state. I'm against the idea of any state like that is like, this is a state of, by, and for X group of people, and everybody else is going to have to either get out of the way or be killed or granted non-citizen status. I'm opposed to that, full stop. Whether we're talking about Jewish people or Mormons. I don't want a Mormon version of Israel, not at all, or a Presbyterian. Like, it's insane. It's insane, and yet it's got so much power and money behind it that we don't even talk about how insane it is. So it would be quite easy to fix a two-state solution. People say it's unworkable, even people that are realists like Mearsheimer. But I think that it seems to be unworkable because the idea that the U.S. would ever get behind it is so unbelievable. You could easily expel the people from the West Bank if the U.S. was for that. And I would enjoy watching those settlers be frog marched out of the West Bank, carrying, whatever. I don't want to see these people killed because I think they're victims of a terrible historical, cultural monstrosity that's really warped their brains. I think that the Israelis are victims themselves in the same way that the Germans were victims in the 30s, although they were obviously victimizers. But people are people, and some strange historical things came together to turn the Germans into the blood and soil fascists that they are. And some horrible things came together to make the Israelis into the blood and soil fascists that they are. And they need to be defeated, but hopefully in a way that's as painless as possible, with as little death as possible and destruction. And a two-state solution it's more than the Israelis deserve, to be honest, but if it should be imposed and it should be fixed, and you could solve that problem, and the Israelis and the Palestinians could live side by side. And I think the world would be grateful for the U.S. for taking that turn, and it's the best way to save Israel.
The best way to save it? Absolutely. No, I think that's the ironic and most truthful way to approach this thing right now. And I mean, there's a lot of cause for optimism in a sense that we are at the end of an empire, the emergence of a potentially new operating system based on cooperation instead of just controlling the plebes in a shadow cave forever. So that's cool. If people want to reach you, Aaron, where do they go?
The American Exception podcast on Patreon, and I am also on Twitter. I think Aaron _good_. So you can find me there. Devil's Chess Club also on YouTube, on the American Exception YouTube channel.
Thank you so much. All right, until next week. Bye.